Yes, thank you very much for this warm welcome. I'm happy to talk you through a very interesting topic, which is authentication. It's a hot topic, and before I really start to make the case about adaptive authentication, I would like to start with a statement. I strongly believe that authentication can be applied in a way that it is convenience for the customer on the one hand, and on the other hand, providing security from a bank's perspective. Before I start really making the case for it, I would like to provide a little background about the regulatory environment, latest trends in digital payments and digital banking, and then I will come to the point and provide insights on adaptive and biometric authentication. So, as you are pretty well aware, I think there's a lot of regulation coming up, increasing the requirements for the protection of sensitive and personal data, but also for security procedures at banks. I put three major regulations here. There are even more, but I would like to concentrate on these three because I believe that they are the most relevant. So there is the PSD2. Everybody aware in effect since beginning of this year, providing new requirements and introducing new regulations such as the factor inherence, meaning biometrics, the mandatory two-factor authentication, the independence of the factor knowledge, ownership, and inherence, and also the dynamic linking, which means for banks that they need to retire certain authentication solutions such as the ETAN. Moreover, there is the GDPR in effect since May 25th. My conversations with banks and industries representatives show how massive these regulations have been in the implementation, but also in the interaction with the customer. Why is it? It's very easy because each processing of personal data means that you need the consent of your client. And this applies also for authentication because there is personal data being processed. A little more interesting, I find, is the e-privacy. Still not yet clear how far it will impact authentication and security procedures. However, what will come up is that end-user devices shall be protected in a way that cookies and other tracking techniques will be restricted. So this imposes a little threat or little problems for behavioral authentication solutions, which really means that I'm using tracking techniques in order to understand the context of an authentication session. So this will come up most likely end of next year and provide interesting conversations and discussions with the regulators on this. On the other hand, we see a lot of things happening in the digital payments area. I have a chart here showing how much there is increase in digital and cashless payments transactions. In Germany, 37.2% increase over the next 4 to 5 years. Not as significant and massive as in other territories, but still significant, meaning 6% average increase a year. Also, we see that instant payments provides much more need for accelerated, flexible, and secure authentication procedures because everything will be processed real time. And in Germany, this is already starting. Hypovereinsbank has launched already instant payments. The Sparkassen and the Volks- and Raiffeisenbanken will follow this year. So there is an increasing need for this. Also looking on new devices that are being introduced, providing real use cases, obvious use cases for biometric authentication. I'm not just talking about desktop and mobile, but also about wearables and the Internet of Payments. So looking onto the mobile part first, as you all know, mobile payment, there have been discussions for, I don't know, 5 years now, but now it is time to really think over biometric authentication for mobile payment solutions, because not only the internet giants, but also the Volks- und Raiffeisen and German Sparkassen have launched their mobile payment products. And also Apple Pay alongside Google Pay is supposed to launch this year, right? So if we think a little bit beyond in terms of wearables, still a niche product, however, it's very much pushed by the industry. So there will be new devices such as smartwatches, such as Fitbits, that all are eligible of initiating payments, right? And also providing real cases for biometric authentication, such as vein reading, such as heartbreak reading, and whatever. Very interesting, but a little bit more looking into the future will be the Internet of Payments, meaning that we are talking about a scenario where all the devices that we are using are interacting, so they are communicating. We see that voice assistants like Amazon, Alexa, Google Home are brought in our homes, really, and providing speech interaction with devices. So there is a use case for voice recognition and speaker recognition. But also looking a little bit more into the direction of the automotive industry, there will be scenarios like in-car payments, so that you can initiate payments while sitting and driving in the car. For example, if you park and want to pay. So there are lots of scenarios that we are talking and that are relevant for authentication. Looking onto what is happening on the bank side and an industry perspective, we see that within the omni-channel banking setup, that data centers are centralizing their authentication solutions by implementing strong centralized authentication servers. This has a lot of advantages. I would like to highlight two of it. First of all, it's much more easy to connect onto different channels in an omni-channel perspective, like the traditional channels, telephone, mobile and online banking, but also future channels such as chats, such as video conferences. And on the other hand, it will become also easier to enroll new authentication solutions, such as biometric authentication solution, fingerprint, voice, behavioral. So we are talking about a set of existing procedures that will be complemented by biometric and behavioral authentication solutions, which, especially for digitally savvy customer, is a new and good method of attracting those. In parallel, all what's happening in terms of authorization will stay in the core banking system. So all the administration of the account, all the necessary administrative processes will be really stay in the core banking system. And this infrastructure provides much more flexibility in total. So I was talking lots about biometrics authentication, but when looking onto how it is perceived by the customer, there is a very interesting chart. It seems that there is only one biometric authentication, namely fingerprint, really accepted by the customers. But all others, like alternatives, like iris scan, for example, facial recognition, voice recognition, is not yet really perceived or even unknown. So there is a potential and still, a challenge for banks to convince customers to use those authentication solutions, which provide at least more convenience for the customer. Security is another very important aspect that is maybe in the public discussion not as strongly considered as the comfort side of things. But however, looking on the latest cybercrime reports, at least for Germany, we see that there is 55 billion euros lost due to cyber attacks. That's massive. And when looking onto the increase of instances and cases, we see a very, very high increase there between 2015 and 2016 of 80%. So there is a really a need to address cybercrime and provide authentication procedures that really provide effective countermeasures. And when looking to the chart right below, when identity theft happens, it is a real damage for the customer and also for the bank, because we are talking about scenarios, 80% of the cases that provide damage of more than 100 euros. So this is really a significant loss that needs to be addressed and to be really managed. But on the other hand, we see things like phishing is not as strong cases as it used to be in the latest in the 3 to 4 years ago. So it seems that the customers are much more aware about the security issues there. I think banks have made a very, very good job into making the customers aware on this. So I provided here now a chart showing what potential attack vectors provide security issues. There is a lot. So there is, for example, on the interface between the channels and the strong authentication server, classic man-in-the-middle attacks. There are massive attacks like distributed denial of services attack. There is attack on the data centers, like on the strong authentication infrastructure and the server software. But also on the devices, right? So every smartphone is not secure because it can be attacked through malware, it can be attacked through cloning of biometric features, and this provides really severe loss and security issues. There is just two things I believe banks can do. Either they provide more security in the data centers through cryptography, through hardening of apps. That's something that can be done. However, it's not sufficient. The customer needs to be addressed as well. So the customer needs to be informed about the security issues when handling with biometric and behavioral authentication. So what does it mean, security and comfort? I think there is a solution, and now I come to really the core of my presentation, and I think the solution is two-sided. First of all, I believe that context-based authentication is something which facilitates better security through analyzing the behavior of the customer, like to what time he is usually authentication transactions. Where does he authenticate transaction? What is the IP address? What is the device he is using? And this all provides a security level against checking of security procedures. And there is a second solution, the adaptive authentication, meaning based on the risk that I'm facing, I increase the authentication level. So I'm imposing a second or even a third factor, meaning that the customer just needs to present the authentication, two-factor or three-factor, when it is really required. And think about behavioral biometrics. The customer doesn't really realize that he is authenticating a transaction. For instance, when you type in your virus, for example, there is an individual behavior that provides enough confidence that it's really you who is wiring the transaction and not somebody else. And this is something that will come up and will be implemented by banks because it provides comfort, and it is also a eligible factor, at least following the European Banking Authority's guideline that behavioral authentication is a eligible factor under the PSD2. So I brought some charts here, how this can be applied. I want to highlight that there is a huge opportunity to apply adaptive authentication, and we see that yet the technology is there providing these scenarios, because thinking about artificial intelligence, we now have enough computing power, enough capacity in the data centers to really process and analyze information real time. And this is just because of the new technology that is enrolled. So I brought two charts here just to provide a little bit more insight about the principle of adaptive authentication. So the left one is a very easy one. It just shows that authentication is not a constant security theme, but rather something that decreases over time. So once, and that is the red line here, the risk level is hidden, it means that there will be needed as a second factor or even a third factor. And this is important to understand. Two-factor authentication over time means it is not as secure as it was when the user has begun the session. But now, and this is the chart on the right, it becomes more complex when you consider other factors such as fraud scenarios, such as environment and context-based analysis. The line is not as linear, but rather oscillating. So it's really a complex mechanism now, but the principle stays the same. Once the risk is too high, you just put in a second factor, a third factor to make the session secure again. And this, I believe, provides security for banks on the one hand and comfort for the customer on the other hand. And that's really the future. And I think where banks and insurance companies need to go. Yeah, that's really the end already of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those now or even later.